Does God have a face? Does he have a body?
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I know I've been quiet for a little while, just doing re-releases, but no, I did not join a monastery or move off the grid. Tempting, though. I've just been buried in a massive project over the past year, a new investigative podcast called Spoiled Fruit, Faith, and Power. In today's episode, it's a little different. I know I was thinking about, like, how do I explain to the Deconstructionist audience exactly what it is I've been up to? And I thought, hey, I know just the guy to help me out with this. So I called Adam, who helped me start this very podcast many, many years ago, almost 10 to be exact. And I talked him out of coming out of temporary retirement to interview me. So that's right. He's back behind the mic asking the tough questions, mostly because I couldn't think of a better way to explain all of this to you. And so, and honestly, Adam, since the very beginning, has been my sounding board through the entire process, kind of helping me work through a lot of content and trying to shape it in the right way and tell the story in the right way. And so when it came time to break it all down, it only made sense to have him host this one. And so, and here's a bonus, by the way. Some of the full interviews I recorded for Spoiled Fruit, of which I have many, I believe need to be heard in full. And so these conversations are powerful, raw, and often being heard publicly for the first time. And I will release them actually right here on the Deconstructionist feed in the coming weeks and months. They deserve space, and they deserve to be heard. And yes, Adam will be back for more episodes soon. Hopefully next time on a topic that doesn't require quite as much emotional processing. So for those of you who are interested, Spoiled Fruit, Faith, and Power officially launches Tuesday, May 6th. So whether you're listening to this the night before or the day of, depends, but it'll be out on May 6th. And yes, new Deconstructionist episodes are on the way too. All right, let's get to it. And without further ado, I'll let Adam kick this one off.
Mystery that is this, a universe.
All right, well, welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I am your host emeritus, Adam Narlock.
I love it. Adam just found out that I put that on the website. So this is fantastic.
This is fantastic.
Well, thanks for doing this, buddy. When I was thinking about ways in which to sort of explain to the audience why I've gone radio silent for months.
You've been a busy bee.
Yeah, it's not for lack of doing podcast stuff. So yeah, I've been working on this and I can't remember when I first started hinting at it, but I've been working on it for over a year. It's been like both gratifying and just like exhausting.
Yeah. It's heavy, man.
It's very heavy. And some of the episodes that were like the heaviest, I'm excited for people to hear because they're really important stories to hear. And for a lot of these folks, it's the first time anyone's ever heard their side of the story. And it was very painful. And you could tell, like, I know people can't see what I'm seeing because I'm actually seeing their facial expressions.
Yeah.
But for a lot of folks, it was very clearly like super painful to bring these stories back up again. And, there were some tears, there's some Xanax.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate and forever grateful for the folks who participate. And there are a lot of people who pitched in to help tell these stories. So,
It takes a lot of vulnerability, a lot of courage to publicly come on and acknowledge these truths, knowing that they sit in the context of probably a lot of trauma, a lot of consequence to their personal life, their identity, probably their family, their friends, relationships, financial, all of that. And then not to mention just the whole like disillusionment aspect of when you're in a church and you're doing the thing and then eventually you're not, that means you had to hit some kind of a tipping point where you crossed over from like, my future is about to look much different than I ever wanted or hoped. And that breakdown is, these people are very, very courageous. And yeah, well, before, let's before we get too far into just us doing our thing here, tell people a little bit about, just give them like the elevator kind of pitch of what this project is and what they can expect from it.
Yeah. Thanks for that. So this started, like I said, over a year ago, and it kind of kicked off because I was actually talking to my ex-wife, and she and I get along very well, and still have a very positive relationship, and we're
Shout out to Jamie.
yeah, shout out to Jamie. We're co-parenting, and we've got an awesome 11-year-old who's thriving, and
Yeah, you do.
all those good things. So
Big claps. Big
yeah.
claps.
yeah. So, she and I, we'll play catch up every once in a while. So, when we're exchanging the kiddo, she told me, so kind of to go back a little bit, when she and I first started dating, we're talking decades ago now. I was a much younger man with way less gray hair in my beard. I think I was 27, and she was 23. And, when you first start dating, you eventually get to that point where you start having those conversations that are really important about, who you are and sort of your life before them. And,
Yep.
and so she had told me, a really, heavy story, of an incident that happened to her. And we were both dipping a toe in terms of like, talking about religion and like, where do you stand on that? And,
Yep.
And so we both found out that we both had a connection to the Vineyard. And I'd gone to Joshua House, which is a Sunday night service that the Big Vineyard, we call it, the one in Westerville here in Columbus, had that's really geared towards, late teens, early 20, mid 20s.
Oh yeah.
We called it the Abercrombie.
I went for a time,
Yeah.
as did my wife.
Very cool church, very cool. And so it's very geared towards that age group. And I went for a while when I was in college. She also went for a while, and we may have even crossed paths without realizing it at the time. But anyway, when she was in it, she was out one night with some folks from her small group, and they were out drinking together,
Mhm.
as early 20-somethings tend to do.
Yep.
And she was giving a male friend a ride home from that group, at which point he assaulted her. And and as a 21-year-old who was confused, as you can imagine, by the situation, she thought this guy was her friend, and so she was really conflicted and confused and didn't know what to do. Went to leadership for guidance. Like, do I go to the police? Like, what do I do?
Right.
And
When you say leadership, you mean leadership in the Vineyard, like in the like Joshua House, like
Yeah.
a young adult church.
yeah, and it's tricky. She and I have both talked about this, many occasions since then, and it's tough because a lot of those leaders at the time were probably, just slightly older than she was.
Yeah, they're kids, inexperienced kids.
Right. And so like you have to factor that in, as well.
By the
Well-
way, this is how youth groups and this is how churches a lot of times get leaders,
Yes.
by just, hey, you, do you want to be a leader?
You're barely out
Which
of
is-
childhood yourself.
Which is understandable, but at the same time, there are some potentially bad consequences to that methodology.
Yeah, and that that definitely comes up in one of the later stories we'll talk about. But so she goes to leadership, and leadership really sort of fumbles, pretty badly.
Yeah.
And they tell her that what you really need is soaking prayer, and so
Oh goodness.
so we can pray for your quote sexual sin.
Uh,
And so they bring her in, or she comes in because she's like, I don't know what else to do. And
Yeah.
she's like, I went a few times. And she's like, and by the way, she's like, when this happens, and for people who don't know what soaking prayer is, we'll have had that episode by this point, but
sounds exhausting.
it's terrible. It's really like long prayer sessions where you're in a room. Sometimes you're laying down, sometimes not. But like, as you know, there's like a ton of people who are just laying hands on you. So for somebody who's just been sexually assaulted, to have both men and women who are like touching you and doing these elongated prayer sessions, and also like putting the focus of the blame on you when you were the victim.
Right.
You didn't ask for
That's the
this.
part that I didn't want to stop you, but that's what stuck out to me is particularly awful.
Yes. I mean, just excruciatingly awful, like victim blaming to the worst degree. And so, like, they blamed it on the fact, well, you shouldn't have been out drinking. And she's like, everybody was drinking. Like, we were all out drinking. That doesn't excuse what happened.
Yeah, aren't you more curious? Like, if you have a problem with drinking, aren't you more curious about the fact that this is a common practice
Mm-hmm.
in your, like, why are you making me feel bad about this?
Right.
If we need to have a larger conversation about that, maybe we can have a larger conversation. But like, that doesn't seem relevant to this.
Right. And we would find out years later that this individual, the male in question here, had done, I don't know to what extent, but had assaulted and to some degree other women.
There were other at least uncomfortable situations. There was a pattern here,
Mm-hmm.
some type of pattern that this was fitting into.
And it's, again, one of those stories where, gosh, if they would have handled it right the first time, we may have prevented, it would have prevented other victims. And so from that perspective, it's incredibly frustrating that there was never any justice.
They didn't do anything about it.
Nothing.
Except tell Jamie that she needed to relive all of her trauma
Mhm.
while people laid hands on her over an extended prayer session where her decisions were placed into question.
Right.
But they didn't actually do anything about the information that she came forward with.
Not to our knowledge. Our understanding is that at some point he may have gone to rehab. They may have pushed him that direction, or because they kind of saw it as, well, this guy's got a problem with alcohol.
But if this is something she brought forward, they should have closed the loop with her if there was something that came out of it.
Right.
In terms of like, hey, we did find a pattern. We did X, Y, and Z.
Yep.
Do you need anything else? None of that was done.
Right. Which this will come up later, just in terms of proper reporting mechanisms and, what do you do when a situation like that occurs? Like, so fast forward many, many years.
Right.
She and I, end up getting married at some point along the line. And she had stopped. And by the way, after the prayer sessions, she stopped going to those fairly quickly on after 2 or 3, and then stopped going to church altogether.
Sure. It's
Yeah.
understandable.
Exactly. And then, so like,
No longer feel safe.
yeah, absolutely. The place where you're supposed to feel the safest, she feels the least safe.
Oof.
And so when she and I meet, we decided to give it another go. And
I'm glad you did.
yeah, me too, man. That's how we met. And so we started going to a different vineyard offshoot for a while. We went there for a while and made some good friends, and then ended up at the vineyard that you and I met.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's important to say, and I tried to convey this at the very first episode of this series, that look, I'm thankful to the vineyard for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Especially the friendships, that I've made through this movement, and had some beautiful times there. But that's not also to say that there isn't some justifiable criticisms that need to be made.
Right.
Because if you love something, you want it to be the best version of itself, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the whole point of this, is so basically to answer,
Especially when you know what's at stake.
yeah. And so,
Like, this is serious.
huge.
It really is. This is a lot of times the epicenter of people at their most vulnerable. It's, church families, quote unquote, really are supposed to be a place of safety for people in need,
Mhm.
people in need of community, people in need of guidance, people in need of, the whole thing is set up to have that. That's the context.
Yeah,
So it's a big deal.
it is. And and so, I think starting to dig into that story, it kind of all kicked off when years later we had stopped going to a vineyard church, but and at one point, obviously, I think I mentioned she's my ex-wife, so we obviously got divorced at some point.
Right.
But again, still very friendly, and she gave me permission to talk about her story. And we've had a lot of conversations about how she's thankful that, hey, she, like a lot of the people whose voices you'll hear throughout this series, largely did not feel like they had a voice. And so, so to get to like how I came into contact with all of them,
Yeah.
couple years ago, Jamie and I are kind of just touching base and just catching each other up on stuff. And she said, you know, it's funny. She's like, I got contacted by Vineyard. Vineyard came to me and they said, hey, we became aware of your situation and some others in the Columbus area, and we've commissioned this third party group to come in, and it ended up being Grace. And
Grace is just a third party like audit service that.
yeah,
Okay.
so they are it's godly response to abuse in a Christian environment.
Oh, so they really nailed that acronym.
Yeah.
All right.
So it's like, ooh, nice job. And so, you know, they have people who are like former law enforcement that work for them, and they're brought in, and they've worked with all sorts of different denominations, non-denominations, and they're brought in to do evaluations, and they really come in and they are very what they call victim centric, meaning that they are there on behalf of the victims. You know, there is no limit to the scope and breadth of the investigation, and then the final report is what the final report is: good,
Mhm.
bad, and ugly.
Yep.
Which really, you know, I think, you know, if you're an advocate for victims, like that is the best way to go.
Yeah.
But, you know, I came to find out later that there are different types of groups that you can bring in for these types of situations, and I, you know, started to learn that, and so we can talk about that. But anyway, to to start with that situation, she was like, "Great, finally, you know, somebody's going to
Yeah.
listen." And they also promised, you know, certain things would happen. You know, we will listen to your story. You know, if justice can be served, we will seek justice, and at the very least, you know, we will provide counseling for the victims where it's needed. And she's like, "This sounds great." you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So she went in and met at this hotel where they were set up, and there were like 3 or 4 people in the room with her, and they talked for over 2 hours, where she, in graphic detail, recounted the entire story from start to finish.
Oof.
And some months go by, and I'm like, "Huh, I wonder, you know, if anything came of that."
Yeah.
And
What
so,
happened?
so I go, "Jamie, like, what, you know, what's going on?" And she goes, "You're not gonna believe this." I was like, "Uh-oh."
Uh-oh.
And she says, "Well, they came back to me and they said, you know, there's not a whole lot they could do with my story, because there was no evidence, because they never directed her to go do a rape kit or anything of the sort at the time.
Yeah.
The age, you know, it's probably past the
Statute of limitations.
yeah, and so there's not a whole lot that we could do. They passed it up the chain. You know, the now national director, Jay Pathak, I guess, allegedly agreed that, yeah, there's not a whole lot we can do there. And so nothing came of it, not even counseling. But then they also tell her, and by the way, we're actually getting rid of this entire report,
What?
this investigation, yeah, through Grace, and we're hiring this new group called Guidepost Solutions to come in.
Okay.
that's what I said. I thought, that's weird.
Why would you need a new group to give a new report?
Exactly.
Because you didn't like the report?
That's what got me wondering. I thought, that makes no sense. You just paid presumably thousands of dollars to have this firm come in, and it's not as if they you know, got rid of him early on in the process. They waited till the investigation was concluded, to my understanding. And
And I'm guessing Jamie is one of many stories that were. I mean, the Vineyard's a big church that's been in operation for a long time. I'm guessing, because you haven't told me all the details about this.
Mhm.
Jamie was probably just part of. I think we should probably clarify that.
Yeah. So Jamie was one of, to my understanding, at least 3, if not more,
Okay.
allegations that were levied that involved different Vineyard churches in the area. So for people who don't know, in Columbus, Ohio, we have a huge presence in terms of Vineyard. So not only do we have now what is the largest church in the Vineyard movement in Westerville, but there's also about 6 or 7 other Vineyard churches, or you know, branches, I guess,
Yeah.
franchises.
Yeah, kind of.
in the area, and then and just even within we're considered in the Great Lakes region, even between Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and so on. There's a huge concentrated population of vineyard churches.
A lot
and
of
so
vineyard churches.
tons.
And this was encompassing all of those?
So this was encompassing all of my understanding was all of these allegations that were levied against. I think it came down to like 3 different vineyard churches in the Columbus.
Okay.
And so
But they needed a new report.
they needed a new report.
So they needed a new auditing service.
Yes. And so I thought, well, that's weird.
That is weird.
So I think now is probably a good time to talk about the varying degrees of what these services sort of cover. And so so I came to find out that there's a spectrum of these types of companies or services that you can hire.
Yeah.
There's as I mentioned before, there's Grace who are on the one side, very victim centric. You have very little control over the final report. They just dive in and they get to the truth, good, bad, and the ugly. On the far opposite side of that spectrum, there are law firms who come in and if you hire them, you are their client, not the victims necessarily.
Got it.
And so they come in and you have a lot of control over the scope and the final report and all that sort of thing. Somewhere in the middle would be a firm like Guidepost Solutions, where you do have some control over the scope of the investigation, what they can review, what they can't. Like,
Oh, so you can say, we don't want you to look at that.
right.
Or we do want you to look at this.
Exactly.
Got it. So it's a little more customizable.
Yeah, and I think you get, my understanding is you also get periodic updates, as the investigation goes along, and then you do have some say over the final report. If you don't like the way a certain thing is worded, for example, you
I have so many questions about this.
oh,
But yeah,
I know.
Well, okay.
So I'm like, interesting, okay,
Uh-huh.
and so that kind of makes you wonder. It's like understanding that, like, why would you go from one that you have no control over to the one you have some control over, unless there's something that you want to control?
Yeah, that's kind of where my questions were
Mm-hmm.
headed.
And so, so again, I'm just kind of, I think I talked to you early on and I was like, man, I don't know.
Yeah, I remember you were starting to kind of find some things out.
And so like, I'm naturally inquisitive anyway. And so I started digging into this and the more I find out, the more I'm like, something isn't quite right. And I don't know quite what it is. And I don't even know if I want to dig this deeply into it, because to be honest, like, I wasn't even thinking about a podcast at that point. But then when that became a possibility, I thought, this is not the type of podcast I've ever done before. I do, listeners here know Deconstructionist is very straightforward. I do interviews with people, very little editing,
Right.
keep it conversational. And so an investigative style podcast is,
This is more journalism.
narrating. Yeah. A lot of work.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, sounds like it.
and it's completely conditional on if people are willing to even talk to you.
Yeah.
You could sit down and be like, I'm going to do a podcast about this, but if nobody's willing to talk to you and tell you their stories, then you've got nothing to work with. And so ultimately in the beginning, all I started to do was reach out to some of the people that I knew, some of the contacts that I had,
Yeah.
and say, hey, do you know anything about what's going on? And I was surprised that a lot of people were like, yeah, you're not wrong. Something's not right here.
Mm,
Have you talked to so-and-so and so-and-so? I'm like, no,
I remember this. It started to kind of
just cascade.
Yeah, you didn't know what you were doing yet, but you were following the threads.
Yeah. And so,
Kind of couldn't not, even though you didn't know what you were going to do with it.
so a lot of phone calls.
Right.
It was a ton of phone calls. Just initially, I didn't record anything up front. I just had a lot of conversations. And there were some people, by the way, who are long-standing, like, staples of the vineyard movement, who were pioneers in the early days, who I spoke with, who did not end up going on the final podcast. And I was trying to be very respectful of people, knowing that this is sensitive and that
Yeah.
there are some folks who like could put their reputation and their legacy on the line just by talking to me. And so
Sure.
there are, 2 or 3 people. at
Which
least-
that's messed up in and of itself, man.
Yeah.
I mean, that's evidence of a problem
Right.
right there.
I know. But it's like, I had to be really
But that's
careful.
legit. That's totally legit. You can get
Yeah.
blacklisted. You can get ousted. You can get your ordination revoked. Whatever they do.
Mm-hmm.
But that's totally legit.
Yeah. So I approached it with, hey, listen, I'll be very upfront with you. I even institute a policy that I've never done before, which is like, if you want to hear the final cut before it goes live, I'm more than willing to send it to you.
Yeah, that's good.
Just because I want you to be comfortable with what I put out.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to be as truthful as humanly possible in terms of the way I see it.
So these conversations led to then you wanted to start to amass some content that you were gonna see where it went, but like potentially like turn into some kind of like an expose or
Mhm.
an investigative series or whatever you're kind of calling this thing.
Yeah. So yeah, and so it became evident pretty early on that I was like, this doesn't really make sense. As much on the deconstructionist side, just based on the nature of what.
Right. No, this is not like a deconstructionist type.
Yeah.
No, deconstructionist is like, hey, listen to this cool perspective.
Right. And I want to keep it that way. And so I thought, how can I? But it's in the same kind of realm, and so
It is a little bit. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely an aspect of, I think the reason we started that podcast in the first place is that there are all kinds of ways that power goes unchecked
Mhm.
in religious organizations and in religious streams of thought. And by the way, outside of religious streams of thought as well. I mean, seems like in politics now, like, there's all kinds of taboo things that you're, quote, not allowed to say or think or, whatever. So the deconstructionist is, in my opinion, more relevant than ever in those types of ways. But this is another angle that while it has some congruent sort of, parallel aspects to it, this is something else.
Yeah. And so I felt that pretty early on. I'm like, I think this needs to be its own thing. And so the work began in trying to figure out what that looked like. And so ultimately that became what it became, Spoiled Fruit,
Mhm.
Faith and Power. And you probably remember about midway through when I had started recording, compile some content, I was like, man, I'm struggling with the theme here and the thread. I know there's a thread here
Yeah.
that ties all these things together, because ultimately I focus on three major issues within the vineyard. I focus on the goings on and the happenings, the assaults that happen, and the spiritual abuse in Duluth, Minnesota.
Yeah.
I focus on similar spiritual abuse by the hands of the Scots, who ultimately pulled the Anaheim vineyard out of the vineyard entirely.
Which was the OG vineyard, the original Wimbers, the Wimber vineyard.
Yeah. Yeah. Which was an interesting story in and of itself.
Yeah.
Started using their own playbook against them. And then the third one was the one that I struggled with figuring out how it fit in. But I knew it was massively important to tell that story too, because there were so many pastors that this applied to, and there's crossover, even with, like, for example, Chris Sauter, who's an awesome guy, former youth pastor in Duluth. He had long since kind of left the Duluth vineyard and got out of that toxic environment, but also along the same time, he was going through some theological changes and evolution, and decided that he wanted to embrace the people in his congregation, become fully affirming.
Mm.
And so, like, so there's definite crossover where these pastors are sort of evolving. And so I ended up talking to all these pastors who they all naively thought that they could all approach the vineyard and be like, hey, may all use the same wording, by the way, which I thought was kind of funny. Not haha funny, but
ironic.
sort of tragically funny.
Yeah, right.
But they all came to the vineyard and said the same thing. Hey, we think we can be the test church for being affirming. But the problem here's where the problem lies.
Oh, you do you?
Yeah. Is
A
that
remarkable idea. Nope.
And poor Ken Wilson tried it, arguably first.
He was so early.
But because they so quietly sort of shoved him out the door,
Yeah, they did.
no one really heard that story. And so no one had sort of that pre-warning that, like, you're not going to be a test church for this. And so they all sort of had that same naivete where they all individually at some point approached the vineyard and say, hey, maybe we can be the test church. And they're like, no. And then the next one, we think we can be the test church. And they're like, no. And so, and so the theme became pretty apparent, especially after you and I had a really good conversation about it. Like, I think you really kind of pointed me in the right direction, which is that ultimately you've got this movement that started out as a loose collection of, I think, 5 churches originally. Birth of the Jesus movement, started by hippies,
Bunch of free spirits, man.
doing baptisms on the beach. I'm like, how cool, man. And meeting in homes.
Barefoot, acoustic guitar,
Yeah.
long hair, hippies.
Anti-establishment,
They just-
anti-flashy, anti-platform. So how did
They
it
wanted to strip
become?
it down to something simple
Yeah. And it's
organic,
anything but that.
and vital, right?
And so it's like, how did this movement go from 5 to whatever it is like now, thousands worldwide, and go from being sort of the anti-establishment and anti-flashiness and anti-platform to a movement that very much seems to really focus on growth and sort of, definitely platform now for sure. I think it would be naive to say that in this day and age that they're not like a lot of other evangelical movements who really have embraced the celebrity sort of pastor worship leader culture.
Yeah. I mean, you look at movements like, obviously like the cautionary tales out there, like the Mars Hill, massive expansion, massive growth from the 90s into the early 2000s. And then just, because of the corruption and the power and the abuse and the toxicity, just completely crumbled from the inside out. And then, you've got other churches that, come under fire all the time for some weird stuff. I mean, it seems like every day or once a year at least, Hillsong is in the news about some kind of shenanigans with one of their celebrity pastors being weird about something.
Yeah.
I mean, and then,
Great M's though.
Yeah, great. Yeah, exactly. And then you've got these other movements that just seem to collect so much notoriety and influence in this internet age of social media and sound bites. And the Vineyard, I think, kind of lost its identity in the midst of these other churches that came along as these rock and roll, high production, energetic, creative type churches. The Vineyard kind of started to like really feel like the boomer that's lost relevance.
And for those who don't remember, like, can we say that you were a former?
Oh yeah, I was a pastor in the Vineyard. Yeah.
So Adam's speaking from personal experience. Like you were.
Oh, you could feel the struggle for sure.
Yeah. And so maybe that's the time for me to ask you a question.
Sure.
From your perspective, so what kind of time frame are we talking about that you were involved as a pastor in that?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So it was so weird because I had just met my wife. We were just about to get married. I decided to go through the Vineyards. I don't know if you touch on this in any of the episodes, but they had their own like seminary that they had partnered with seminaries locally here. Like
They used to.
Yeah. When I was there,
It's gone now.
when I was there, yeah, they had this seminary program called VLI, Vineyard Leadership Institute, which while I was a part of it, like just before graduation, the guy running the whole thing, who was a mentor of mine, was caught cheating on his wife with this younger lady, and there was a whole legal thing that ensued on that. So he was my mentor and professor through VLI. But yeah, anyway, I went through VLI, and gosh, man, I think I graduated from VLI in like, was it 2011? And pretty much right after that, got linked up with this little church plant with these really genuinely great people that I met through VLI. And instead of going to this huge church where there was like 10,000 people going to this big vineyard in Westerville, I really found it attractive to be a part of this little startup community. And they wanted to ordain me. I had a gift for preaching and teaching, and they wanted to ordain me, and that was never really my desire, but I was like, yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah.
I guess what else am I doing here? So it was always pretty weird for me because I was never a full-time pastor. I always did it like what we called, like, I was a bivocational leader. So I had a job in corporate America working for a big pharma company, slinging drugs. Actually,
You were a legal drug dealer.
I was.
Interesting.
I was. It's all true. And then I was just helping kind of do whatever I could to bring whatever perspective, helping hands, friendship, leadership, preaching, teaching, leading classes, running small groups, whatever I could do to just kind of try to make something genuine, which is what I think we were all initially after. But growth and the need for growth, in my experience, does funny things to people.
Yeah.
Not all like bad. Just it gets weird
Mm-hmm.
when you feel like you need to grow. There's one thing that happens when something organically just has life on its own. It could be an idea, it could be a project. Look at like the deconstructionists. We had no idea. That was riding a wave.
Yeah.
We didn't have to force, push, we didn't have to do anything except turn the mics on and talk to people and put it on the internet.
Yeah.
And before you know it, hundreds of thousands of people are listening to this thing. And we're like, what the heck happened?
Yeah.
That's just surfing a wave. And initially, a church plant usually feels a lot like surfing a wave. There's a really organic, attractive vitality to it that's inherent in it. And then something always has to just naturally change. That fizzles out, and you have to decide how you're going to pursue whatever your next way of living as an entity is. Like, are we just gonna flatline? Are we gonna shrink a little? Are we okay with that? Do we want to push for growth? And like, I get it, pushing for growth in terms of like Christian thought is pushing for salvations. You're saving people from hell. You're trying to influence the community with Christian morals, which a lot of times are really, really good things. It's easy to be like, yeah, okay, like I'm down with that mission. And then you're like, I don't feel like that's really, I feel like we really just want butts in the seats and more tithe in the coffers. And like, I was a part of it. Like, I was swept along with it as well, but it's hard to grow. Growth is such a weird thing in terms of church because we are in a capitalistic corporate context, and it ends up having all of those flavors. Your marketing and your canvassing and your pushing and your branding and your trying to attract people. And really what you're normally doing is the people you're attracting are just, you're taking them from other churches.
Yeah.
Like 90, probably 8% of your growth is just people from other churches.
Yeah.
So it just gets really weird. And I definitely was not called to that kind of life. It was difficult to leave people. It was not difficult to leave that.
Yeah. Did you ever feel like there was pressure? Because I always felt like a lot of these churches, especially because there's such a large concentration in the Columbus area, sort of all live in the shadow of the Westerville, the Cooper Road.
Oh yeah, everybody
Because
does.
it's huge.
Yeah.
And so, like, did you ever feel like when you were on staff, pressure to sort of be the next, Cooper Road?
No, not like be the next Cooper Road, but you definitely felt pressure to be something special. Like I remember leaders bragging that, they'd go to a conference, which since I had another job, I never was able to go to most of those conferences. One time I was able to go, and it was really just because Miroslav Volf was going to be in town, and I really wanted to meet Miroslav Volf, and I got to meet him and talk to him, and it was great. But like the whole like pastors getting together to talk about their churches, like really, I hated it. So I didn't get down with like what are you doing? Well, what's working for you? And like, here's what we're doing. And I remember a couple times it was mentioned that like the vineyard that we were a part of was the cool kid on the block at the time. That we were getting all of this growth, that the hipsters and the artists and the musicians and that they were kind of coming to our church. That was kind of the name we'd made for ourselves. And I remember how good everybody felt about that.
Yeah.
And then looking back on that, being like, it's so weird, the things that made us feel good.
Yeah.
Like, really, like, what are we doing here? But my point is it's like, you're really just swept up in things that you don't realize you're swept up in. You don't realize it at all. You don't realize how much capitalism and what I would call very, very secular power dynamics, not the power dynamics of the cross.
Yeah.
Not the power dynamics that was modeled by Jesus. Not those power dynamics. Very JP Morgan, Walmart, McDonald's, NASDAQ, American power dynamics. You don't realize that is a part of the way you think, if you talk about growth at all, inside that word, inside that concept, it is pregnant with all those other things, unless you intentionally and deliberately run it through a filter to draw those things out. And if you don't do that intentionally and deliberately, they're all in there. And it just is what it is.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting to have to like do that all the time. So most churches that pursue growth end up pursuing growth the way of Walmart and not the way of the cross.
That's an awesome segue, because I think it is important to talk about sort of, and you and I years ago, and of course we were largely talking about other churches or other movements, but I think it's important to talk about sort of the corporatization of in this context, evangelical Christianity, and the fact that some of the things that I felt that were really important to talk about in the first episode were to kind of jump ahead to some of the systemic issues that I saw as I saw them.
Yeah.
Because I felt like it was important to talk about them up front to kind of foreshadow, like, here's how we created the perfect environment for these bad things to happen.
Yeah, man. And yep.
So some of the things that you just talked about are definitely some of the things that became abundantly clear. So like, it felt very much like, and by the way, this is all like, a lot of this stuff is publicly available. So, oh, thank you, sir. We're going to take we used to be really big. We were trying to get LaCroix to sponsor us.
How many LaCroix did we drink when we were recording those episodes back in the day?
Now we're on a Polar. Polar's delicious.
Yeah, they're all the same to me. It's just whatever's on sale.
Polar's delicious. Yeah, drink a Polar.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to sponsor the podcast, just look in the show.
It is kind of a shame that we're in my like whiskey room and we're not having a pour, but Sunday through Thursday, I try to not.
Oh, same, man.
I just let myself on the weekends.
New job, getting up earlier.
That's what I'm saying, man. Getting older, you can't just have a couple drinks every night anymore. My liver's gonna just jump out my mouth and run away one of these days.
Got to keep it to the weekend. But yeah. So some of the things that I thought were kind of wild is, and again, like if you go to Vineyard USA's website, for example, they do a great job, I will say, of posting everything on their website. And so what's interesting is you can look at their annual sort of reporting, and they posted on there. I think you can go back multiple years, but if you look at the most recent one, you can see they track an insane amount of metrics.
Yeah.
It's a lot of metrics.
Yeah.
And, again, you and I both work in the corporate world, very familiar with the corporate world and the way the corporate world runs. I kept thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is like corporate America.
Yeah.
These are KPIs.
Yeah.
The sort of the same sort of metrics that we would kind of be consumed with or obsessed with at work are sort of what they're looking at. They're just named differently. So if you look on the annual report, they track things like salvations and baptisms.
That's that's
Church
the one that,
plants.
like, I do get why they do it, in terms of, like, they're basically like, they're hamstrung. Their hands are tied because they know that they exist based on their theology to save people into the loving grace of God and out of eternal damnation.
Right.
That is what they're trying to accomplish. So I understand wanting to report on that. But how do you know, man?
No.
How do you know?
And the
You
pastors who
don't.
came on who were like super honest about it were like, dude, this is so
Come on.
fuzzy. And so, so we got in a lot of those conversations. Like Chris Sauter, like, does a really articulate job of sort of talking about like how that's just impossible. And then a lot of the other pastors I talked to brought that up too. They're like, look, it's really dependent upon where you're located too. Like one of the pastors I talked to, she has a church that's in the middle of the Bible Belt. She's like, finding anyone who hasn't like said yes to Jesus at some point is impossible.
Dude.
Like it's so heavily inundated with churches there. Like everybody at one point or another has prayed the salvation prayer.
Yeah.
Like, and so it's really hard. And then on the flip side, Chris mentions, at one point, like, you look over and that kid over there has prayed it 17 times, but you count it every time he does it.
Every single time.
So like, so that's one thing is just like this heavy emphasis on metrics. A lot of the metrics you notice are based around growth, and they're like growth related metric.
Oh yeah.
And so there is a huge emphasis on, and it's everywhere. You see wording that's revolves around, church planting or church growth and all these things. So you notice pretty quickly that like they're very obsessed with growth on some level. And then the deeper I dug, the more I found, some other problematic things too. And again, like, people are going to maybe be a little critical of the fact that I do a lot of comparison to like the corporate world. But in my defense, if you're going to act like a corporation, then you also have to operate like one, meaning you have to have the same sort of protections in place.
You can't have it both ways, is what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
Like my company that I work for right now, a biopharmaceutical company,
Mhm.
has in-house counsel. They have HR. They have compliance departments. The whole goal is, we as a company have gained a lot of influence and resources from people that have taken our medicines or invested in our company, our employees, the patients we serve, the doctors we serve. All of these people are counting on us to do something with this immense amount of potential and resources and power.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some kind of check in place to make sure that we're doing what we say we're supposed to be doing with that.
That's such a perfect way to look at it, because it's not just putting in safety mechanisms for the sake of having safety mechanisms. You are representing an institution, and there's a name behind it, and there's a legacy behind it.
Absolutely.
And not having those safety mechanisms in place is saying that like you're okay with playing it loosey goosey on the chance that somebody could sully that legacy that you have worked so hard for. And it's just,
well, it might actually be a more apt metaphor than I even realized when I started it, because the reason, again, I'm in a pharmaceutical company.
Mhm.
We all remember, or if you've paid attention, you remember the heydays of big pharma that got itself in a lot of trouble because it grew so fast and did a lot of really shady things with, the data and how they ran their clinical trials and what they were doing with this money. New laws had to be put in place, like anti-kickback laws, because doctors were essentially being bribed to prescribe this medication over that medication just simply because they got a trip to Hawaii to become a consultant or whatever. So bottom line is growth needs to be held accountable, and there needs to be checks in place in institutions, because it doesn't matter. In fact, it's even more important in some ways in religious institutions, because religious institutions, represent themselves as being those that are serving the vulnerable and the people in need. And they meet people oftentimes at their weakest points in life, with a belief system that says that they are speaking for or are, ordained by God. That's a lot of power.
It's a huge amount of power.
And if there's not transparency, and if there's not checks put in place in organizations that get this big, who's gonna hold them accountable?
Right? Yeah, and that's one of the big sort of like red flags that I saw, and sort of digging into. I'm like, well, what kind of structure do they have in place? And so some of the things that I saw is potentially problematic from the perspective of like, comparing it to my corporate life and saying, well, we have these checks in place because we know these types of things happen.
Right.
And so,
And we've gotten in trouble in the past.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like you and I said earlier when we were talking before we started recording, look, it's not a naive thing where we're sitting here saying like there's a perfect system that can be put in place to prevent these things from ever happening. No,
Absolutely not.
they're gonna happen. It's how can you minimize how can you lessen the frequency of them happening, and when they do happen, minimize the impact.
And I would say also, how do you handle it when they do happen?
Yeah.
Because in my opinion, it's critical. It's
Mhm.
absolutely critical for these things to be handled with the utmost transparency and empathy and care and concern for anyone that may have been potentially victimized in any way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so couple of things that I started to notice, and by the way, because you are a former vineyard pastor, some of these will probably not surprise you at all because you've probably seen this firsthand. But some of the things I started to notice is like, gosh, like Vineyard has a lot of like married couples in leadership and
Yep.
sometimes in co-leadership,
Yep.
which seems to be like an immediate conflict of interest. We have policies, for example, the very large financial institution that I work for has policies in place that say that if you are in a relationship of any kind, you cannot be in a position of power over the other. And typically when they find out that two people are even dating, they separate you so that way you have no sort of influence over the other person.
So you don't have a conflict of interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's nepotism policies in place.
Yep.
As you mentioned before, same with my company. We've got a separate HR department.
The funny thing about that is I can't say, obviously my wife Sarah was not in a position of leadership, nor did she want to be. So I can't speak for anybody that's done it before. But I can say that I did witness multiple times that like, this is really hard.
Yeah.
To like do this as a couple. So outside of even just the like nepotism and conflict of interest, and when you really do start to look at the fact that you're asking people every Sunday for money to support your organization and to support your vision, and you're asking them to trust you blindly, a leadership structure that doesn't take seriously the problems that are inherent with that I mean, looking at it now, I was, obviously a kid when essentially, in a lot of ways, or I felt like one. I didn't even think of that
Mhm.
at the time. But now looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, yeah, it's fine if it's just a little group of people, but as soon as you become like an organization, it's a problem.
Yeah, you've essentially, in effect, have two CEOs who basically go home together every day, and like what you end up seeing is like stories in like Duluth where Michael and Brenda Gatlin were having like couples fights in the middle of staff meetings, and then everybody's like feeling awkward, and then Michael Gatlin would turn around and be like, "All right, what's next on the agenda?" And they're like,
Oof.
"What the hell?" And literally that's what Chris says. Um, and so like to your point, it may happen. It may work really well in one instance, but that's not to say that it works really well in every instance. And there's a reason most companies have policies in place.
Yeah, and exactly.
And then you get into the nepotism issue where, in Duluth, for example, Brenda Gatlin, who's a co-lead pastor, pushes really hard to get her son Jackson into ministry. She's like, he's made for ministry. And this guy is like, from all reports, was just sort of all over the place from the beginning, and really sort of unreliable, it seems, and was just sort of unpredictable in a lot of ways. And there were reports over and over again. There was a HLI report. You remember HLI?
Mm-mm.
Heroic Leadership Institute?
No,
I don't believe it exists anymore, but it was like train future leaders.
not for lack of a great name.
Yeah, I know, exactly, right? Chris even started laughing when he because heroically. But it for a time it existed, and it was a leadership development program, and so Jackson was a leader in this program, and there was a report made by some folks who went through that program that was like a 56 or 57 page report, pretty beefy, and in it they alleged that Jackson had sexually harassed that individual, and also that Brenda was incredibly abusive. And so this report, because there's no reporting mechanism or third-party reporting mechanism, goes to Vineyard USA. And because there was no like mechanism or formal process for this, you just sort of emailed leaders that you thought should be the ones to field this.
Right.
And so it goes to them. They funnel it back to Michael Gatlin,
Oh my gosh.
who, what's he going to do with a report?
About his son and his wife?
Right.
Okay.
So he disappears it, and it comes up in the Grace report over a decade later, and they're like, "Where is this report? Where did it go?" But they followed the chain, and figure out that Michael made it disappear.
Oh my gosh.
And so there's not only nepotism issues just sort of baked in, but there's also this lack of a true sort of third party reporting system. And oftentimes these reports would get funneled back to the people that the reports were about. And then on top of this, like just for fun and giggles, I pulled up 40 random Vineyard churches across the United States, that map that they have.
Yeah.
It's very convenient. So I'm clicking on 40 random churches, and I'm just looking to see how are they structured from a leadership perspective. Over half of them were led by married couples. And even the ones that weren't led by married couples often still had married couples in positions of leadership. And then it was very hit or miss in terms of whether or not churches, at least publicly, had some sort of board, formal board or board of elders or council, and when they didn't have that setup, it varied wildly in terms of how many people were on that board of elders or council. And oftentimes they also had married couples involved as members of that. And a lot of the times the lead pastor was also a member of the board.
So if anything serious were to ever really come up and get brought to these boards, you already have a problematic structure that it's going to be difficult for, like essentially human nature is like we're going to get each other's backs,
right?
Like we're gonna support each other. And
that's exactly what we see.
that happened specifically in the Duluth situation. And so unfortunately, within the Duluth situation, finally, decades later, Chris is actually the one that a former youth group member comes to him and says, "Hey, there's a girl that I'm friends with who was also in the youth group who was assaulted by Jackson, and she swore me to secrecy, told me not to tell anybody, but I kind of have to say something because I'm watching Jackson continue to elevate up the ladder.
You're like, oh no.
And like, I would not be doing my duty unless I said something, because he's going to put himself in a position where he has leverage over other people, other vulnerable people." And so, long story short, thank God Chris reports this to the right people within the staff. There's a great guy who's currently the interim pastor at Duluth named John Kluwer, former lawyer, had the wisdom to realize that like we have to find a way to go around Michael and Brenda, because this report is about their son.
Yeah.
We know they can't think objectively about this. And by the way, he was also the one that helped them write a nepotism policy for their local church. And Brenda in particular allegedly like was really against this, and was saying like, I need to continue to oversee my son and all this stuff. And so, despite that, they voted for it, they passed it. And then apparently 2 weeks later, Michael went to the board kind of behind the scenes and asked for an exemption for both he and his wife, and it was quietly granted. And so years later, when Grace comes in, when John, and the special counsel they formed there hire Grace to come in, Chris is sitting down in his interview, and the Grace interviewer says, "So what you're telling me is if that nepotism policy would have stuck, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today." And Chris is like, "Yeah."
Oh my gosh.
He's like, "Yeah, because perhaps he would have reported to someone else and they would have stopped this long before
Man,
they did."
there's just so much in and around all of these situations that I know when everyone gets a chance to listen to all the episodes of Spoiled Fruit, it'll be up to them to really take from it, what they want, interpret it in whatever light that they want to interpret it. But if you could just concisely kind of say overall, like what you think the main point of all of this kind of is, what would you say?
I think it's to, because I'll be honest, when I started out, I even say this in the first episode, like, look, this is not meant to be a hit piece,
Right.
on the Vineyard. But the deeper,
And I know that too. Like, I think that that needs to be said. Like, I know your heart. Like, I know how much you love a lot of these people. And this is, from what you've told me, meant to hopefully make things better, potentially safer.
Yeah.
With better accountability, more transparency for these organizations. So this is not a hit piece.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Like, I've really struggled with this because I still have a lot of friends who are actively engaged, and I've called several of them,
It's unpleasant, man.
and I was like, "Hey,
It's that unpleasant conversation.
yeah," and I'm like, but I'm largely at this point doing it for them
Yeah.
because they are still involved in the organization. It would be no different than if you worked for a company and I found out something, about that company where it put you at jeopardy. It put you in a situation where you weren't safe,
Yeah.
and I knew about that.
Right.
Like, it wouldn't be cool if I didn't at least alert you and at least try to do whatever I could to help sort of change that.
Yep.
And so from my vantage point, from what I've been able to see through all of this, is that there seems to be a disconnect between the local Vineyard churches and the national entity.
Okay.
The local churches, it seems to vary, again, because some have boards, some don't. Some have great bylaws in place, some don't have bylaws at all. And so there's a varying degree of accountability and accountability structure in place.
Yep.
And so I see that as one of the the main issues. The other issue I see is that the national entity has kind of leveraged this idea that like the local churches are autonomous, and they've sort of by and large used that to kind of determine when they want to get involved and when they don't. And I think now is a great time for them to do some really good things. I think, for a long time, this movement that came out of, the 70s, out of the Jesus movement,
Yeah.
that has really operated as a movement and not a denomination, has to recognize what it truly is today.
Yeah.
And they have to realize that they cannot continue to operate when they're this large without sort of the safety mechanisms in place that a large entity of its kind needs to have in place to protect its people.
Right.
And that's not, top-down power structuring necessarily, but what it is some very simple things. It's a third-party HR, even if it's not a department, hire a couple HR people
To be like your national
Yeah.
HR people
that have a third-party anonymous hotline that
that have
folks can
training.
call, training, and they're starting to do some training, so there is some intent there, like they're trying to train people on what to look for.
That's good.
So that, that's a great thing. They've also written a child safety policy, which from my vantage point looks really good. And so I think that's very important. But I think they need to do something in a way that gets all of the churches to sign on to it. And I know that might feel denominational, but it's just,
let's
you
come
gotta
on. Let's cut the crap. It is a denomination.
They're a denomination, yeah.
I always used to laugh when people would be like, "Where do you go to church?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, I go to the Vineyard." "Oh, what's that? What denomination?" And I'm like, "It's non-denominational, but it's totally a denomination." Like,
Yeah.
of course it's a denomination. It's global. It's worldwide. They've got their own statements of belief and
Yeah.
theology and ways of doing things. Yeah,
Well, and I think, I think
it's so dumb.
I think there are some things that they could learn from some of the traditional denominations. Like, anytime you can look at somebody who's been doing it longer and learn from their mistakes, I think so you don't have to go through those same mistakes is like a valuable piece of history that you can pull from. And so there are some really cool things that they could learn from other denominations. And, so one of the things that I did was I talked to, my current pastor happens to be a Lutheran. But, it could be any other denomination, but like just for the sake of comparison, I talked to my Lutheran pastor and I said, "Hey, like, what are some things?" So right now, Vineyard USA is very, very interested in formal ordination because there has not been a real concise formal ordination process. But the problem is, as they outline it in their new handbook, it's very, very vague, very vague. Some of the wording is just like, well, so for an example, in order, some of the criteria, I can't remember, this might be like number 4 on the list or something, I can't remember, but to be even considered for ordination going forward, you have to be able to display a substantial understanding of the Bible and theology, either formal or informal.
What does that mean?
Exactly. So this is what's problematic about the way it's written right now. And you're asked to sign off on this. They were asked by May 1st to sign off on this. And so my first question, as somebody who used to write legal procedures for my company, like, how do you define substantial? Who determines whether or not you've met that level of substantial?
Right.
How are we defining formal versus informal? And it feels like, okay, guys, like I think I know what you're getting at. Why don't you just have a formal seminary program?
Yeah.
Because, if you look at like Lutherans, for example, it's a 4-year program. It is not for the weak.
Right.
You go through Greek and you learn some of these languages that the original text is written in, so you can kind of understand like how it, there aren't always like for like words in translations, and so that kind of helps. There's some foundational things that help, I think, as you become a pastor. But beyond that, they also took like counseling courses and things
Yeah.
that you're gonna need
Yeah.
when you're out there. But a big piece of it too is right out of the gate, they have you take a psych evaluation and a background check. And like, so under the new handbook, they
Seems
do
like
have
table
background
stakes,
check in
right?
there. Yeah, they do have
Table
background
stakes.
check in the new one,
Yep.
but it's all the way down at the bottom. Like, you might want to start with that one up top. That might eliminate some of your candidate pool. But like, these are things that like are important because it determines whether or not you have the mental faculties, the right
Yeah.
qualities that we want representing our.
Can you do the job?
Yeah. And so there's some very simple things that, and then there's some kids jumping around upstairs. But there's some really easy, that's a really easy way to determine if you've met that level of substantial. If you have effectively made it through seminary, and at the end, it's almost like it reminds me, it's sort of like the process for defending your dissertation for your PhD. You get in front of a panel and they ask you questions and basically make the final determination if you're fit for the ministry.
Yeah.
And so that's your bar for substantial. If you make it through the program,
Right. But
You've
this
met
is
that-
like,
you
but yeah, this has got, it's all subjective.
right. And so the policy as it's written now is incredibly subjective. There's a lot of vagueness to it. And then on top of that, like, you also have issues where, and we talked about this on the podcast, the series as well, is like, there's a lot of issues right now theologically with like people not being on the same page. Well, some of that can be ironed out through a formal seminary process.
Yeah.
Like, of course, people think different things because there's no coursework that you complete collectively.
Right.
There's a small elephants on parade upstairs.
I know.
It's my favorite. But yeah, so there's some things that could solve for a couple different issues that they're having. So that's just one of them. But another one would be, a non-retaliation policy. So if you do call the anonymous hotline and report something that's going on, like spiritual abuse or, God forbid, sexual abuse, that you're not going to suffer retaliation. Because, to be quite honest, one of the things that happened while I was getting ready to push out this podcast was the interim pastor, John Kluwer, who blew the whistle initially in Duluth. Almost immediately, as they are kind of pushing it back against Vineyard USA, some national leaders from Vineyard USA, Rob Morgan, who pops up a couple times with some problematic leadership decisions, in my opinion, came forward and said, well, there has been some allegations of spiritual abuse or some leadership issues with you. And so Duluth again did the right thing. They brought in, they hired an individual to come in and investigate. He removed himself entirely, put himself on suspension, essentially, and
Until it was all hashed out.
right, was just formally cleared. Like, the investigator found that there was no substance to it whatsoever. But Rob himself refused to be a part of the investigation when asked. They asked him multiple times, like, you're the one that brought forward the accusations. Will you come and sit down for an interview? And he wouldn't do it.
What?
And so even if it wasn't retaliatory, like, to even get rid of the idea that it could be retaliatory, you have to have some rules in place, some policies.
I mean, on the surface, that looks retaliatory. Whether it is or not, I don't know. But it has the appearance of that, which is bad enough for anybody that's, again, you're saying you have spiritual authority as a pastor.
Mhm.
Spiritual authority from God. You need to be above reproach. You need to always be above reproach. You can't even have what looks like the ability to misuse your power and your authority. And I think that's when I kind of looked at a lot of the threads you were pulling together.
Mhm.
I'll tell you what I think my hope for this type of thing is that there needs to be some healthy pressure on leaders who assume the mantle of authority from God on high casually in their communities, that they are going to be in situations they're not ready for.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be in situations they're not trained for. And they're going to be in situations that all of their motivations are to get out of it or sweep things under the rug, because it's their livelihood, it's their church growth, it's their, once their authority, it's like, dude, when we first started doing like the deconstructionist thing and we started questioning like the validity of like the inerrancy of scripture or, you know, whatever things like that, people are like, well, it's all going to fall apart then. You know, it's like, well, in the same way, a lot of leaders, once their authority gets questioned, they feel like that calling, that mantle, that power,
Mm-hmm.
essentially, that they have from God is now called into question. And they are just the old man behind the curtain pulling levers and, you know, speaking into a microphone. And that terrifies all of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the church is supposed to be, and Christians are supposed to be salt and light in the world, preserving righteousness, morality. It's where social justice movements started from. I know we live in more of a secular age now, that people think that you can just be good people. It's like, well, it's a nice thought.
Yeah.
So far, that's not happened in history, where people without any sense of God or religion or whatever. So, but essentially, like, you're supposed to be salt and light. As a church that wields all of this power and authority, and as a leader of a church that has all this power and authority, who's holding you accountable? Who's watching the watchman? And that is where I think you, as a journalist, are filling a necessary role that journalism is supposed to fill,
Mm-hmm.
and that it does keep governments and power structures in check by saying, we're going to try to find the truth and we're going to tell people the truth. That shouldn't be a problem, because you should be able to tell people the truth. But if you're not going to, I'm going to.
Yeah.
And that becomes a service, in my opinion, to the least, the last, and the lost, who need somebody to say, look, church is a beautiful, wonderful thing. I could go on a rant right now on why we still need churches, and we need them to do a better job is what we need.
Yeah.
Because so much of our trust, because of these types of things, is waning, and we don't have another place to put it. We need churches. We need churches to do a better job. I long for that. And it might be through people like you that stand up and say, I don't know why this came to me, but I need to do something with it. And then whatever happens, happens. So kudos to you, man.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where I don't know why it came to me, and I certainly have no dog in the fight.
Right.
You know, I'm not in any way affiliated with the Vineyard at this point in my life.
Nor were you personally injured by the Vineyard. So it's not,
No.
This is not a hit piece. It's not retaliatory. It's not,
Yeah, it's just
like, whoa, I found some stuff and dang.
yeah. And do I think that any of these folks in these positions of power, like the Rob Morgans or the Jay Pathicks of the world, are horrible human beings? No, absolutely not. You know, I don't know them personally. I just know the actions that I've seen, and I think, you know, there needs to be some system of checks and balances in there. Like, there are still some issues there, you know.
Yep.
You know, largely the Vineyard, as local churches, do not vote for their national director. And on top of that, like, you know, the national director and I think it's like two other people are the ones that will they get what's the word I'm looking for? Recommendations, or not recommendations, but like people will propose members to the board of trustees.
Like nominations?
Yes. Thank you. They'll nominate people, but then ultimately at the end of the day, the final say goes to the national director. I think there's one like higher level member of the board of trustees, and then a third member. So there's essentially three people on the national level who basically, look at the list of nominations and confirm, basically hire, the next person to be on that board of trustees. And so like, there's some very easy, I think, areas in which they could fix some things. They could make it a little less. And something you mentioned earlier too, I just want to say real quick, is the fact that this word relational gets thrown around a lot in the Vineyard, and man, that can be such a good thing, but it could also be a hindrance. And I think Jay has even publicly admitted that some of his judgment may have been clouded early on in dealing with the Gatlins because he was personally friends with Gatlins.
Yeah.
Well, you see that on a lot of levels. So like there's different tiers of leadership here. You've got the national group, you've got super regional leaders, area leaders. But the problem becomes when someone raises a hand and all these people are intermingled as close friends, it becomes very hard for you to make a judgment call or
oh dude, the social pressure, the groupthink, and that it gets really, really hard to take a stand.
So it's like, so there's some things. And then, to your point earlier, like when you say like the national entity really has the opportunity to kind of set the precedent and be the model, but it's kind of hard to take them seriously if they try to enact any kind of nepotism policy because the national director's own wife is also on the national board.
Right.
And so it's like, then you have to start asking questions. I think you have to ask questions like, well, was she the best person for the job?
Yeah.
And like, and maybe she was. I don't know. But like,
no, yeah, maybe she was. But the question needs to be asked. That needs to be a possibility that somebody can say, is this the best way to, I guess even more broadly, power and positions of power should not be left just unchecked for people to just do whatever they want with them.
Right.
It just shouldn't be that way. It really, really shouldn't. And this casual approach that I can tell you, I probably shouldn't have been ordained. Truly, I probably shouldn't have been. I had no experience. I just went through like a neighborhood seminary program, like, a local, like I call it a neighborhood seminary program because it's, it was legitimate in a lot of ways, but like, I mean, it was also thrown together by a church. Like, it's just, it's important because you're responsible for people that are going to trust everything you say as if it's coming from the mouth of God. And that is what terrifies me about a lot of this stuff.
And there's a lot of very heavily spiritually loaded language.
Yeah.
That popped up in a lot of these stories. Like, well, for example, like Alan Scott, when he moved from Northern Ireland to California, he said, well, we moved to Orange County because God told me to.
Can't really question that, can you?
No, I mean, that's a conversation ender right there.
Right. Can't question that. There's no more conversation after that.
Yeah. And so like, there's, I would just like, I think in the end for the folks listening, and I know, that there will be some folks probably from the national group who check in to see what, what I'm up to.
What's going on?
What is this guy doing? And I know there'll probably be some local, vineyard pastors who listen, but I would just encourage them to look at the evidence, to look at the resources page on the website, to dig in for themselves and see if they notice the same sorts of issues, and just ask themselves, like, is this who we want to be? And are we comfortable with the lack of safety mechanisms, both at the local and national level? And are we doing the best by our people, especially those who are the most vulnerable? Because it kind of feels like the answer to that right now is no. And I would also encourage them specifically in probably arguably the largest, most public display of where this structural institutional failure occurred in Duluth, Minnesota, where you've got double-digit victims. At no point so far, as of this recording, has Vineyard USA specifically apologized to those victims. They kind of put out a kind of a broad base apology, like, yeah, we screwed up. We had some institutional failures there that we need to do better. So the problem for me is they keep saying it's this future talk, future tense sort of thing, where they keep saying, well, we got to fix this. We got to do better at this. It's been years now. Fix it.
Yeah.
Fix it. Like, it does not take 3 years to implement policies that are very simple. I could write them for you, that they could implement tomorrow or very soon. That would be very, very easy things that would fix a lot of these problems. But the victims see these things and they say, well, how long are you going to promise the son and not deliver? And it's not enough. It's not enough to sit here and say, like, look, we excuse the fact that the prior administration didn't do anything because they were working within the constraints of the system that they had. There are some very obvious things that could have been done, despite the fact that they ultimately don't, and still currently don't, by the way, have the power to come in and really make, huge changes, because the national entity doesn't have that type of power. They're working on that right now for better, for worse. But there's some very easy things that they can do. So one of the things that they like to do, I don't know if you ever heard this in your time, but they call it the nuclear option. And the nuclear option is when, if there's a local vineyard church that's really misbehaving, they can come in because Vineyard USA owns the trademark to Vineyard. And they can say, if you don't shape up, we will pull the Vineyard name off of your church. That's the nuclear option. They seem to only use this in instances where there's a massive theological disagreement, like the LGBTQ, stories, that will be heard on this podcast.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to leverage that when they really need to. And so they could have come in and they could have taken the allegation seriously, starting with Michael and Brenda, who predate Jackson, where there were numbers, including a letter written by a former Duluth pastor across town back in 2014 that wasn't taken seriously. But they could have gone in. They could have gone in personally. They could have brought in a third-party investigation group then to look into it if they had taken it seriously. And they could have threatened the nuclear option if that local church council hadn't taken action at that point. But they didn't. So to say that they didn't have power to do anything is absurd. And so, at the end of all of this, my hope is, like, I hope that at the end of the day, that they truly are good people with good hearts and they mean well. But they need to see the institutional failings. They need to see that the solutions are right there, and they need to take action now. Instead of delaying this out and saying, well, we will do this. Like, we will eventually do this. Even the current handbook, and I encourage people to look at it, it's posted right on the Vineyard USA website, as well as the new bylaws and the nepotism and conflict of interest policy, which, by the way, the conflict of interest policy really only covers financial dealings. And so they're trying to stop future Anaheims from happening, which, okay, but you're not dealing with the root cause here.
No.
And so look at all that material, make your own decision. But ultimately, the vineyard pastors out there who may or may not be listening, like, do your due diligence. You owe it to yourself and you owe it to your congregants to do your due diligence and make sure that you are informed and that you understand truly what's going on. And you need to push your leaders. Ann Arbor, I give them kudos. They sent a letter, a very strongly worded letter, saying that these things need to be implemented. And they said, we will withhold our 3% tithe. And Vineyard USA, as of about a week ago, I think, just disassociated them from the vineyard.
Wow.
So I understand that is a scary proposition, that too could happen to you. But I would ask you again, would you rather cede power and continue down the same path with no safety mechanisms in place, or stand up for what's right and protect the people in your pews?
Can't think of a better way to end it, man. I know this has been a lot of work. I think it probably needs to be said that, like, you're not paid to do this kind of stuff. This is you followed a thread of authenticity and just genuineness of people aren't being heard. I have a platform. People might not like it. They might think that I'm bitter or jaded or out to just gain listens for something that is not financially profitable.
No.
But the bottom line is like, I hope that anyone with any authority in any church, not just the Vineyard, but specifically the Vineyard,
Mhm.
listens to this for at least one reason. And that's, you're going to get some perspective that you could do something with if you're just open to listen.
Mhm.
The things that can change our lives as people the most are not compliments. Oh, pastor, what a great sermon. You changed my life. Oh, your church is an answer to my prayer. Fantastic. That's great. Feels really good. But hearing your shortcomings and hearing the places that there are some blind spots, and that organizationally, there are some contexts that are allowed that create a lot of problems for people. If you're not willing to just hear that and go, you know what? We didn't mean to do that. And I didn't even really realize that. But John was a little hard on us on this one. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he said, but you know what? He's actually got some really valid points. I need to look at that, and we should do some things differently. We should have some conversation. That I would ask for at least that.
Mhm. Yeah, and again, with any kind of somebody who once said, I love documentaries, and somebody, some documentarian who I can't remember now, it's been years, once said, look, every documentary has an angle, whether it's intentional.
Of course.
And so, like, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like there isn't, an agenda.
Right.
I'd like to think that the agenda is to try to enact action in places that like need action taken to protect like vulnerable people. And so like that's sort of the thing I'm sort of trying to point the finger at in this series. But yeah, you're right. There will probably be people who are angry and pissed off at this podcast because there are some things that don't make the Vineyard look very good. But again, I would point back to say, like, it's nothing I did, I'm just shining a light on some institutional failures and not to embarrass anyone, but just to say, hey, like, we could all do better in some areas, right? And so,
Listen, man, need I remind everyone, and this is the last thing I'm going to say.
oh, you're good.
But if you're taking the Bible seriously, even within the canon, the last book of the Bible, which no one, in my opinion, does a great job interpreting, some are better than others, but there's letters to churches
Mhm.
about how they're screwing up and how they need to pay attention because it's serious and it's important. I'm sure that didn't feel good.
Mm-mm.
Like, I'm sure that it's like, but I'm really trying here and I gave my life to this. And don't you see that, like, we're serving and it's like, am I saying that you are, amending letters to the 7 churches or whatever it is in a Revelation? No, of course I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, like, it sucks to hear that the work, the benevolent work that you're doing in service of the gospel is maybe not as clean and as good on hygiene, and maybe not without its blind spots. It's grow up. It's really not a big deal to hear that. Like,
Yeah.
come on.
Well, it goes back to something we said years ago, right? Like, modern Christianity seems obsessed with growth. It's like, you want growth, you can get it organically. Be authentic.
Yeah.
Be authentic. Be humble. Admit your mistakes.
Transparent.
Be transparency. My gosh, like, this generation, that's like a breath of fresh air.
Dude, if you're going to keep asking people that frankly can't even afford it for tithe,
Yeah.
because it's quote unquote obedience to God, which is a stretch of scripture that we could go on about, you should literally publish quarterly
Mm-hmm.
every penny that gets spent out of your church and what it's spent on.
Yeah.
If you're asking people for that money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Honestly, like, and I think the ways in which Vineyard reacts from here on out will say a lot. We'll tell people, like, if they really mean it or not. I want them to mean it. Like, I hope they do. Because again, I still have tons of friends who are still actively involved on various levels.
Yep.
And I want the best for them. And so, like, you want butts and seats. I am telling you, by taking the humble path and saying, yeah, there's some things we could fix here.
Yep.
And like, we're sorry to the people who were negatively impacted by this. We are so sorry. And offering counseling, which I know they've done to some degree, but like really, like just taking it and saying, yeah, like we're going to own this.
Yep.
But we're going to be better. And here are the ways that we are going to be better, not like what we will do in the future, but here are some tangible things that we're going to implement right now. Like, and these things are going to be put in place to prevent these things from escalating to the point where they have historically.
Let's hope so, man.
That'll put butts in seats. I guarantee you.
Yep. Let's hope they hear it.
Well, thank you, buddy. Thank you so much for doing this. And
Hey, man, I love you. I'm so proud of you and happy that you're just pursuing this work in all of these different ways, man, keeping it alive. You're an important voice out there.
well, I hope people enjoyed hearing the soothing baritone. I don't know if you
Host emeritus.
That's right.
It's great to be back.
Well, thanks, man.
Absolutely.
We'll definitely do this again. Hopefully with a lighter topic, maybe next time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll definitely have to do a regular deconstruction episode. So love that. That's hopefully soon.
Awesome, man.
All right, man. Thanks, buddy. You got it.
If he does he know that I'm alive? Is God even here? Does she care that I doubt? Does she care that I fear? Something tells me God will survive. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know. I think the truth is, if God has a face, his face must look like yours. Did God kill his kid? Did he have to have blood before he would forgive? Maybe we made a God that looks like us. Does God know my name? Is the ache in my soul just confined to my brain? Even so, does that mean it's not real? So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this, a universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face, her face must look like yours. like a Tina, and Ahmed or Mildred, or Russ and his husband, Gus and their children. Face like a Kim, a Ted or Tyrone, a Lucy born with an extra chromosome, a Pablo with legs he can't move by himself, a girl born a Daniel who now is Danielle, a Bill H. and Yee, even white guy's name Todd. If you have a heartbeat, you are the face of God. So take a breath, breathe it in, the mystery that is this universe we don't know, but I think the truth is, if God has a face must look. If God has a face, his face must look.